CKGSB, China's only not-for-profit independent business school.
I think, particularly in the West and in the United States that I'm most familiar with, there are a number of misconceptions about the Chinese economy. One is that the state is very dominant, that it's the major part of the economy. Another misconception is that state firms are all very monopolistic, that they have a lot of market power, and that they earn what some people characterize as astronomical profits, and this enhances the whole role of the state. A third misconception is that the state is very large. It has a large, powerful bureaucracy. A fourth misconception is that the state enterprises absorb most of the lending from the banking system and that private players get squeezed out, they're starved for capital. And a final misconception, I think, is that somehow when President Hu Jintao and Premier Wen Jiabao were in power, that there was a resurgence of state firms, that state firms were very important in the Maoist era, that they faded away under Deng Xiaoping, and that they enjoyed a resurgence and an increase and a return to prominence in the period, say, from 2003 to 2013. When you look at the evidence to see whether or not these things are true, these widespread conceptions or the consensus view, it turns out not to be true. In terms of the dominance of state firms, in the industrial sector, state firms used to be totally dominant, and today they only produce a quarter of output. In manufacturing, they only produce a fifth of output. The real source of growth in the manufacturing sector has been private companies. Similarly, in terms of employment, state-owned companies used to be responsible for a very, very large share of employment in urban areas. This has fallen dramatically, and the total number of people employed in state-owned enterprises and state-controlled enterprises today only accounts for about a little more than 10% of the urban workforce. Most people are working for private companies. More importantly, if you look at the growth of the labor force in China over the last 3 or so decades, almost all the growth is accounted for by the expansion of private businesses. On the credit question, one of the reasons private companies have been able to grow fairly rapidly is that they have gotten better access to credit in recent years. It is true that historically state-owned firms did absorb most of the credit, but I think in the last 10 years that has changed. If you look at the most recent data for the last 3 years, state companies, if you look at the flow of money to enterprises, state companies are getting about a third of the money and private firms are getting a little bit more than half. So the empirical evidence doesn't really support the view that state companies have, complete control of credit. And finally, on the resurgence of state companies, particularly if you look at the manufacturing sector, private companies grew twice as fast as state companies throughout the 10 years that Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao were China's two main leaders. So it was a continuation of the trends of an earlier period when private companies, particularly in the industrial sector, have just simply grown much more rapidly.